Hello, and welcome to Gratz College's first ever adult learning webinar. My name is Lori Cohen, and I'm the Director of Non-Credit Adult Learning Programs at Gratz College. We're delighted that you're joining us here for the webinar today. During the presentation, please make sure that your volume is turned on and up. Gratz at Home is a 6-month subscription to a monthly webinar series. It's similar to the one that you'll be seeing right now. Each month, you'll hear from a different Gratz faculty member speaking on a topic within his or her own expertise. The schedule of faculty and their topics is already available on our website. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Finkelman, President of Gratz College, speaking about Abraham Lincoln on the occasion of his birthday. Enjoy.
Good evening, and thank you for joining Gratz College in our new online webinar. I'm Paul Finkelman, the president of Gratz College, and because tonight is Abraham Lincoln's birthday, I will be giving a talk on Abraham Lincoln and the process that led to the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of slavery in the United States. When he became president in 1861, Lincoln faced a crisis that no other president has ever faced. 7 states had declared that they were no longer part of the United States. They had created a new country called the Confederate States of America. Lincoln's main goal when he became president, was to bring the Confederate States back into the United States. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln addressed the southern states. He did not talk to his northern constituents who elected him. He focused on the question of secession and the possibility of civil war. He said, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors." Lincoln had no intention of using force against the Confederacy because he believed that after a few weeks or even a few months, the southern states would come to their senses, as he would have said, and come back to their proper position in the United States. He told the nation, but really he told the South, "You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." This is, of course, the oath as President of the United States. He denied that the South had a legitimate right to secede or a legitimate reason to secede. He noted apprehension exists among the people of the southern states about the problem of slavery and whether or not their property, as they called their slaves, would be secure under the new Republican administration. Lincoln said, "There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension." The southern states claimed that secession was necessary to preserve slavery, but Lincoln said unambiguously and forcefully that the national government had no power whatsoever to end slavery or interfere with slavery in the states where it existed. He says in his first inaugural, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." This was an accurate summary of Lincoln's position throughout the election of 1860 and when he entered the White House. Why does he say he has no power to do so, no inclination to do so? Because the Constitution clearly leaves the regulation of something like slavery in the hands of the existing states. Slavery is considered to be a, quote, domestic institution of the states, like real estate law, like most criminal law, like property law, like laws regulating marriage, divorce, child custody, etc. And therefore, Lincoln said, the national government simply cannot touch slavery where it exists. He urges the Confederate States to come back into the Union. But that does not happen. And from the time Lincoln is inaugurated in early March into the middle of April, there is this crisis within the United States as to what is going to happen. Lincoln does nothing. He shrewdly does not attack the South. He shrewdly does not call for enlistment of troops. He does not move the army anywhere. The only thing he says he will do is to protect American forts along the coast of the South. So particularly in Charleston Harbor, there is a fort, Fort Sumter. And what Lincoln says he will do is to bring food to Fort Sumter, but not bring more men, not bring military supplies. Southerners cannot stand the waiting. They expected, because of their own ideology, that Lincoln would attack them. And when Lincoln does not attack them, the South doesn't know what to do. And finally, in the middle of April, the South decides to move on its own by firing on Fort Sumter. Now, what we must understand about Fort Sumter is the cannon in Fort Sumter, the high walls in Fort Sumter, all face the Atlantic Ocean, because this fort was designed to protect Charleston Harbor from an invasion from the sea. It wasn't designed to protect the fort from an invasion from Charleston itself. And so Fort Sumter is quickly facing destruction, and it surrenders, and the Civil War has begun. Lincoln immediately calls for 100,000 volunteers from across the northern states to defend the United States. He asks these volunteers to enlist for 3 months. He believes it will be a short war, he believes it will be a quick war, and he believes that quickly the South will return to the United States and the war will be over. He also makes clear that he has no interest in interfering with slavery, because as he understands the geography of the United States, and as he understands the politics of the United States, if he interferes with slavery in the 7 states that have seceded, then the Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, the remaining 8 slave states might also join the Confederacy, and he does not want to happen. At the same time, from the beginning of the war, many people insist that the war is about slavery and that what Lincoln should do is end slaves. One of the most prominent advocates of moving against slavery is Frederick Douglass, the black abolitionist who is perhaps the most prominent African American, not only in the United States, but in the world. Frederick Douglass is known everywhere. Frederick Douglass and other leading blacks say it is time to make war on slavery. But Lincoln says, no, I cannot make war on slavery. I'm not going to make war on slavery. And one of the reasons why he won't make war on slavery is because of the geography of the United States. So here we see a map of the United States in 1860. And at the moment, at the beginning of the war, the Confederacy consists of South Carolina, Georgia. It consists of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. He is worried about Virginia and Kentucky and Missouri joining the Confederacy, as well as Arkansas and Tennessee, because that will change the nature of the war. And so Lincoln pushes hard not to attack slavery, not to change the nature of the war. But when the war begins, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas joined the Confederacy. And so now it has 11 states, not the 7 states it has. For Lincoln, the key moment, the key issue is what is going to happen with Kentucky. During the very beginning of the war, a group of ministers go to Lincoln and they say, if you will free the slaves, you will have God on your side. And Lincoln says, I would like to have God on my side, but I need Kentucky. And why does he need Kentucky? Because if you look at the map, you see that the Ohio River runs all along the northern border of Kentucky. If there's a Confederate army sitting on the southern edge of the Ohio River, this Confederate army threatens Ohio, it threatens Indiana, it threatens Illinois, and it's easy enough for the army to march up into Pennsylvania. If, however, there's a United States Army on the southern boundary of Kentucky, then the United States is much more likely to win the war. Furthermore, if you think about moving soldiers, moving material, moving weapons from one place to another, if the United States controls the Ohio River, it can manufacture things in Pittsburgh, in Ohio, in Indiana, put them on the Ohio River, take them to the Mississippi, and invade the South this way. But if the South controls the Ohio River, that dramatically changes the nature of the war. In addition, Kentucky has the 3rd largest population of any southern state. But more importantly, it has the 2nd largest white population. And so from the perspective of where will the South get soldiers, Kentucky is critical to the war. And so at the very beginning of the war, Lincoln does nothing to end slavery. But while Lincoln does nothing to end slavery, the slaves themselves fully understand what the war is all about. And the slaves will ultimately move on their own, running to United States Army lines for freedom. So this is the picture in the spring of 1861. By September 1862, a mere year and a half later, Lincoln will issue something called the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that he is going to end slavery in 100 days. Why does he wait 100 days? Well, for a variety of political reasons. Also, because he wants to end slavery on an iconic day, and 100 days is January 1st. So he wants to start the new year off correctly. He wants New Year's Day to be Emancipation Day. Lincoln understands symbolism. So how does Lincoln go from saying, I can't touch slavery, I can't end slavery, to issuing the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation? This is what I want to talk about tonight. Before doing that, I want to say something about the Emancipation Proclamation itself, because it is a very narrow document. And it does not have a lot of flowery language. It does not talk about liberty and freedom. It is not like the Declaration of Independence declaring that we are all created equal and endowed with the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rather, it is a narrowly drawn legal document written by a very good lawyer, which Lincoln was. One historian once complained that the Emancipation Proclamation has all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. Now, what is a bill of lading? Bill of lading is the piece of paper you sign when you give something to UPS or FedEx. It says, I'm giving this package to you, and you're going to deliver this package to somewhere else. And indeed, if you read the Emancipation Proclamation, you get the sense that it is really a dull, boring document, kind of like reading your auto insurance policy or reading a bill of lading. Next time you send something from FedEx, take a look at the document you're actually signing. Very boring. Lincoln has a purpose for this. He is writing a legal document to end slavery. He is not writing a political document about the gloriousness of ending slavery. Other scholars have also complained that Lincoln's commitment to ending slavery is weak, that he is not personally committed to slavery, to ending slavery, that he is only ending slavery because he needs to win the war. And certainly the Emancipation Proclamation says this. The Emancipation Proclamation says, I am ending slavery with my power as Commander-in-Chief of the armies of the United States. But for Lincoln, this is the only power he has. He can't end slavery as President of the United States. He can't issue an executive order. But what he can do is end slavery in those states which are in rebellion against the United States, because as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, this will help with the war. So the Emancipation Proclamation, dull, boring, pedestrian, as another scholar calls it, a bill of lading, becomes one of the 2 or 3 most important documents in the history of the United States. Many years ago, I was asked to edit a book series for 5th graders, and it was on important American documents. And it had the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and a couple of other major documents, and had the Emancipation Proclamation. And I called up the editor of the press and I said, this is a great list except for the Emancipation Proclamation. Have you read it? And they said, no, but isn't it a great document? I said, well, I'll send it to you. I'll email it to you. You can read it and decide for yourself. And the next day they called me up and they said, can you think of a different document to use? Because it had all the moral language, all the moral value of a bill of lading. So now let us go back to the inaugural. Lincoln says, I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the United States where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. This, of course, is an orthodox position of understanding the Constitution. But as the war begins, these things begin to change. And the change comes quite early. The change comes in early May 1861. less than a month after the war began, 3 slaves owned by a Virginia slave owner who was also a colonel in the Confederate Army run away to Fortress Monroe. Fortress Monroe is in Virginia, and Fortress Monroe is commanded by General Benjamin Butler. Benjamin Butler had been a lawyer before the war. He's not West Point trained. He's not a professional soldier. He is what in the Civil War we call a political general. Benjamin Butler had not even been a supporter of Lincoln, and he had not been a Republican. The Republican Party, of course, was a brand new political party. It was the anti-slavery party. It was the party of equal rights and racial equality. And Butler had not been a Republican. He'd been a Democrat, which was the pro-slavery party in those days because it was dominated by the South. But Butler is now a general, and Butler is in command of Fortress Monroe in Virginia. And 3 slaves run away to Fortress Monroe. And immediately Butler admits them into the fort, gives them new clothing because they are basically dressed in rags. Now, what kind of clothing does the Army have to give soldiers? Give runaway slaves? Well, blue uniforms. And so he puts these 3 runaway slaves in blue uniforms, and they begin to work for the Army, and he begins to pay them a salary. A couple of days later, a Confederate major in full dress uniform comes with a white flag to the fort and said, "I'm here to get the runaway slaves that belong to my colonel. Would you please return them under the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Law of the United States?" Butler looks at this guy like he's kind of out of his mind and wonders, what is he talking about? But he doesn't say that. He says, "Come back tomorrow and we will talk about this." And the next day, the major comes back and Butler is prepared. Butler had spent the entire night reading books, not reading books on tactics, not reading books on war, reading law books, because he is a lawyer. And Butler concludes that if you treat slaves for purposes of military fighting, in this case, these slaves were building forts for the Confederacy. If they were part of the Confederate military, not as soldiers, because slaves don't fight in the Army, but they're being used by the Army, then the slaves are no different than any other military asset. They're no different than guns or horses or cannon or wagons. And he tells the Confederate major that these slaves are contrabands of war. And as contrabands of war, they cannot be returned to the Confederates. He does say, however, that if Colonel Mallory, who owns these slaves, is willing to come to Fortress Monroe and swear an oath of allegiance to the United States of America, then he can have his slaves back. But of course, this is a gesture that is meant for political purposes because he knows perfectly well Colonel Mallory isn't going to come and swear an oath to the United States. Colonel Mallory is in the Confederate Army. And so we get the beginning of emancipation. And essentially what Butler does with 3 slaves, Abraham Lincoln will eventually decide he could do with 3 million slaves. That is, if slaves can be considered contrabands of war, if slaves are being used for the purposes of making war, then it is okay to end slavery. And so this is Lincoln's journey. In order for Lincoln to do this, in order for Lincoln to move on emancipation, he needs to create 5 separate notions and political positions within the government. First, he has to have a constitutional theory, because remember, in his inaugural address, he says, "I have no power to end slavery." So he has to find the constitutional power. Well, General Butler essentially has given him the constitutional power. General Butler is saying, there's a war going on. You have a war power. The war power allows you to do this, and therefore, I can do this. But that constitutional power has to be developed over time. Second, he needs to know that he has the political support of the Congress of the United States. There's no point in moving against slavery if Congress is going to vote it down. Third, he needs to know that he has popular support in the North, because if he tries to end slavery and loses the election in 1864, then he's not going to end slavery. He's not going to accomplish what he wants. Fourth, he needs to secure the loyal slave states. He needs to secure, as I said, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, and most of all, Kentucky. As he said to the ministers, I'd like to have God on my side. I need Kentucky. And so from early 1861 through the following spring, 1862, one of Lincoln's goals is to secure these northern slave states. Finally, he must win the war. Because as Lincoln says over and over again, if I don't win the war, then declaring emancipation is a waste of time. And so we are back to 1861 here in Virginia, where the slaves have been freed by General Butler, and we are going to move forward to see how Lincoln accomplishes this mission and how things change. While Lincoln is thinking this through, General John C. Fremont, who is the commander of U.S. troops in Missouri, takes it upon himself to declare that slavery is over in Missouri, and that any slave owned by anyone who's even sympathetic to the Confederacy, haven't had to do anything, just if you're emotionally sympathetic, I can take your slaves from them. Immediately, Lincoln gets letters from all over the United States, but particularly from his loyal allies in Kentucky and Maryland and in Southern Illinois. And they say, you have to overrule Fremont, because if Fremont's order is accepted, then we're going to lose Kentucky. And if we lose Kentucky, we lose the war. We might lose Missouri. If Missouri and Kentucky are both Confederate states, it's going to be very difficult to win the war. And so Lincoln contacts General Fremont and says, please rescind your order. Please take your order back. He does suggest to General Fremont that if slaves are being used by the Confederates, as they had been in the case of Benjamin Butler, he can free the slaves. He also points out that in July 1861, Congress had passed something called the First Confiscation Act. First Confiscation Act says that if slaves are being used for military purposes, you can have a process to bring the slaves before a military court and emancipate the slaves. So it tells Fremont there are ways of doing it, but you can't do it by an order. Fremont is very arrogant. He believes that he's going to be the Republican nominee in 1864. He had been, by the way, the nominee in 1856. He'd run for president in 1856 as the first Republican candidate. The slogan that year was great. It was free soil, free labor, free men, free speech, Fremont. And Fremont had done very well for a brand new party. He carried a number of states, but he didn't win the election. He believes that he's going to go back and win the election. Get the nomination in 1864. Instead, Lincoln tells Fremont to withdraw his order. When Fremont refused, Lincoln countermands the order. He then moves Fremont out of Missouri, and shortly thereafter, Fremont's career is over. Meanwhile, other things are happening. And one of those is the military situation in Tennessee. In early 1862, an unknown brigadier general, a man who had been a failure at everything he had done in his life. He failed in his military career. He failed as a shopkeeper. He was broke most of the time. But now with the new war, having gone to West Point, he's suddenly put in command. And this unknown failure in life is named Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant, in the space of about 2 weeks, captures 2 Confederate forts in northern Tennessee. And by capturing these 2 forts, General Grant changes the nature of the war. If we go back for a moment to our map, we can see what we're talking about here. Because now, instead of Confederates possibly being in Kentucky, you now have the U.S. Army sitting in northern Tennessee. Rather than the Confederate Army threatening Indianapolis or Springfield, Illinois, or Columbus, Ohio, the state capitals of the Midwest, you now have the U.S. Army threatening Little Rock, Arkansas, threatening Nashville, Tennessee, and possibly moving on to dismantle the Confederacy. The second fort that Grant captures is Fort Donelson. And the commanding general at Fort Donelson had been Grant's classmate at West Point. They were friends. And this is, of course, one of the ironies of the Civil War, that you had people who knew each other on both sides fighting the war. And the Confederate commander tells Grant, yes, we'll surrender. What are your terms of surrender? He's expecting that all of the soldiers will be paroled. They'll be able to go back home and be farmers. That Grant's going to be a nice guy because we were friends in West Point. And Ulysses Simpson Grant, Ulysses S. Grant says the terms are unconditional surrender. And after that, he's known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. He immediately becomes Lincoln's favorite general because he has done what none of the other generals have done. He's captured a major Confederate fort. He's moving into the South. He fights and he wins. And so when General Grant captures the forts in Tennessee, this is the beginning, the very, very slow beginning of the end of slavery in the Confederacy. So now Lincoln believes that he may have the possibility of actually winning the war. Following this, in February of 1862, you have a series of United States victories throughout the war. United States troops, with the help of the Navy, sail into New Orleans, take the largest city in the Confederacy. United States troops take Baton Rouge, which is the capital of Louisiana. American troops move into Nashville. They move into Little Rock. So you now have 3 Confederate state capitals that fall. And in the spring of 1862, the Congress begins to act in ways that Lincoln can only be happy with. So one of the ways in which the Congress acts is to pass a series of laws that begin to attack slavery. The first one is actually to declare that slavery is over in the District of Columbia. Now, the District of Columbia is a peculiar place because it's not a state. It doesn't have any local autonomy. And in fact, under the Constitution, the District of Columbia is governed by Congress. So this is the one place where Congress can end slavery. And so in the spring of 1862, Congress passes a law ending slavery in the District of Columbia. Now, because slaves are property, and because they are property protected by the Constitution, and this is something many Americans today are uncomfortable with, the notion that the Constitution actually protected slavery, but it did in very many ways. You can't simply take property from people. You can't walk in and say, we're taking your slaves. You have to pay them for their slaves. And so the Emancipation Act for the District of Columbia provides a schedule to pay for slaves who are owned by people living in the District of Columbia. The payment is relatively low. Congress appropriates on average 300 slaves. Congress appropriates on average $300 for every slave. And of course, slave owners said, but my slave's worth $1,000. And the answer, of course, is timing is everything. Your slave might have been worth $1,000 in 1860. You should be happy you're getting $300 in 1862. And so Congress begins to dismantle slavery in the District of Columbia. Congress then passes a law ending slavery in the federal territories. Congress does not provide compensation for slave owners in the territories. There are relatively few slaves out in Kansas, out in Utah, out in Nevada. These are the territories. There are some slaves in what is then called New Mexico, which today would encompass both Arizona and New Mexico. But by and large, there aren't very many slaves. But what Congress says is this: slavery was never legally created in the territories. There's no law creating slavery in the territories, and therefore these slaves became free the moment you brought them into the territories because there was no law making them a slave. So Congress ends slavery. And it is in this context that another general begins to act, General David Hunter. General David Hunter is different than John C. Fremont. He's not an egomaniac. He's not planning to run for president. And in fact, General David Hunter is a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln had been elected president and he went from Illinois to Washington, D.C., Hunter rode with him as his personal bodyguard. And Hunter, furthermore, is an abolitionist. He hates slavery. Hunter is commander of the United States Army in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Now, you have to understand, commanding South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida is kind of a myth. because all of these are still Confederate states. But recently, the Navy combined with the Army had seized the Sea Islands off the coast of Charleston. Hilton Head, where people now go for vacation, was a major accomplishment for the United States because now you had U.S. troops based in South Carolina on these islands, and there were tens of thousands of slaves on these islands. And when the U.S. Army comes to the islands, the slave owners run away, abandoning their plantations, abandoning their slaves, and Hunter is in charge. And so General Hunter declares in May 1862 that all slaves in Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina are now free because he says slavery is, quote, incompatible with a free nation. It is incompatible with the spirit of the United States. Now, Lincoln tells Hunter to revoke his order. Lincoln sends a very nice, warm, personal letter to Hunter saying that generals do not make public policy. Presidents make public policy. And so he says, you cannot free the slaves. But he says in this letter, I make known that whether it be competent for me as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy to declare the slaves of any state or states free, and whether at any time, in any case, it shall be a necessity indispensable to the maintenance of the government to exercise such supposed powers, are questions which are under my responsibility, I reserve to myself, and which I cannot feel justified leaving to the decisions of commanders in the field. And so, what Lincoln is saying is, in very broad terms, I have this power. If I decide that I need to free the slaves, I have the power, but it's my power, it's not the general. General Hunter is fine with this. He's not going to fight with Lincoln. But General Hunter's proclamation changes the nature of the war in a very important way because people in the North are thrilled with General Hunter's proclamation. For one reason, they hate South Carolina. South Carolina is where the war began. South Carolina was the first state to secede. Northerners say, yes, go do in South Carolina. And so General Hunter is popular, but General Hunter's order is revoked. Shortly after this, Lincoln meets with a group of congressmen from the loyal slave states. These are the slave states which is not seceded: Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, and he meets with them and he says, you should go back to your states and try to get your states to end slavery. He points out that Congress has issued a resolution, passed a resolution saying that if these slave states will free their slaves, Congress will compensate the owners for the loss of their property. That is to say, Congress is willing to appropriate money to give every slave owner in Kentucky. By the way, there are 200,000 slaves in Kentucky. This is an enormous amount of money. He's willing to give every slave owner in Kentucky money if Kentucky will declare that slavery is over in Kentucky. And Lincoln goes to meets with these members of Congress, and he says, you should go back and get your state legislature to push for freeing the slaves. Excuse me. But these representatives don't do this. Instead, the next day, these representatives attack Lincoln. In this meeting with the representatives, Lincoln not only says that you should go back to your states, but he says you should do it for a very practical reason. He says that the friction and abrasion of war, it's a great phrase. He says the mere friction and abrasion of the war is going to end slavery. You're going to lose your slaves one way or the other. And if you don't take this offer, slavery will be gone and you will have nothing valuable in lieu of it. In other words, he's really telling these politicians, you got to go back home and make a deal. Get what you can get now, because this may not be on the table a little bit later. But as I said, these members of Congress don't do that. They say, we're not going to do that. And then Lincoln tells them about General Hunter. And he says, General Hunter is a friend of mine. General Hunter is very popular. General Hunter is an honest man. And he says what General Hunter wanted to do in South Carolina and Georgia is going to happen everywhere, and you better move on it. Instead, the next day, most of these congressmen and senators published a public letter attacking Lincoln, saying that emancipation is unconstitutional and that the border states will never free their slaves. This is July 13th. That night, Lincoln begins to draft the Emancipation Proclamation. He sits in his office in the White House and he begins to write out the proclamation of how you will end slavery. And a couple of days later, he meets with William Seward, who had been the governor of New York, a senator from New York, and who was now the Secretary of State. And he meets with William Seward, and he also meets with Gideon Welles, who was the Secretary of the Navy. And it's interesting because Welles had been a Democrat before the war, but he was an anti-slavery Democrat from Connecticut. Seward was a leader of the Republican Party, and in fact, Seward expected to be the nominee in 1860 and was shocked when he lost to Lincoln. But Lincoln brings him into his cabinet. Very similar, by the way, to the way Barack Obama brought Senator Clinton into his cabinet. Senator Clinton thought she'd get the nomination. She doesn't. And Obama says, well, come be Secretary of State. He's following Lincoln's model. You take the person who was the runner-up and you give him an important position. He meets with Seward and he meets with Welles, and he tells them what he is doing. Now, I want to tell you something about the craft of history, because the craft of history is very interesting. You might ask, well, how do we know all this, right? We know all this because we read diaries, we read letters, we investigate. And Welles, after the Civil War, publishes a diary. He apparently kept a very detailed diary. You know, pages and pages. It's 2 volumes of his time in the cabinet. And he enters in his diary that Lincoln told me and Seward that he was going to free the slaves. Most historians had thought that this was Welles simply bragging. Most historians believe that Lincoln would not have told Welles this, or Seward, because he's keeping it a secret. And certainly not Welles, because Welles isn't in the inner circle. And for many years, historians would cite the Welles diary and then say, but we don't think there's any evidence other than Welles, who published the diary years after the war is over. And you're always suspect about in people's memories, you know? When somebody tells you that something happened later, you want to corroborate it in other ways. I mean, this is one of the tasks of historians, is to take 2 or 3 pieces of evidence and put it together. And it's especially true with politicians because they're kind of puffing themselves, right? I was there, Lincoln told me, right? Well, a few years ago, a very distinguished historian at Columbia University, Eric Foner, wrote a book on Lincoln and emancipation. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It won another prize called the Lincoln Prize. A great book. And in this book, Foner said he had discovered, and he quotes from it, a letter that Welles writes to his wife the night after he met with Lincoln. And in this letter, he says, I met with the president today, and he told me something extraordinary. I'm sworn to secrecy, but it's really, really important. So now we have the corroborating evidence that Lincoln almost certainly met with Seward, met with Welles. They went on a carriage ride. And a few weeks later, he presents to his cabinet the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a very, very famous engraving by an artist at the time, Alexander Hay Ritchie. It's Lincoln first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. It certainly wasn't like this. Certainly they weren't standing there stiffly like this. But you can see the members of the cabinet. Here's Secretary of War Stanton with his long beard. This is Salmon P. Chase, who had also expected to be the presidential candidate in 1860, a Republican from Ohio. He's the Secretary of the Treasury. He will later become Chief Justice of the United States. Here's Seward sitting over here, and the guy with a really big beard is Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. By the way, if you ever saw the Steven Spielberg movie on Lincoln, Lincoln is always talking about Welles. He always refers to him as old Neptune. Remember, Neptune is the sea god. Well, Welles is the sea god for Lincoln because he's the commander of he's the Secretary of the Navy. And so he meets with Welles and Seward, and he tells them about this. And he's later going to tell the cabinet. But in the meantime, before he actually goes to the cabinet, Lincoln signs a new law from Congress called the Second Confiscation Act. Remember, the First Confiscation Act allowed for a very complicated process where you could free some slaves. Second Confiscation Act is much more direct. It says the Army will free the slaves of anybody using slaves for military purposes, any military purpose, including, by the way, growing food that would be sent to the Confederate Army. Furthermore, the law provides death penalties, including treason, for anybody who gives aid and comfort to the enemy, because it's considered to be treason. So now Congress is really ramping up the pressure on the Confederacy. In addition to this, the Second Confiscation Act does something else. It provides for the use of soldiers in the Army. Black soldiers, former slaves. Now, there had been black soldiers in the American Revolution. There had been blacks at Valley Forge, very close to here. There had been blacks in Washington's army. In fact, by the end of the war, there were so many black soldiers in the army that commentators no longer even noticed them. Early on, you get letters saying, I was at Washington's camp and there were, Negro soldiers. That's really interesting. Never seen them before. By the end of the war, they're everywhere. There had been black soldiers in the War of 1812. But in fact, since the Revolution, it had been illegal to use black soldiers. But now Congress is saying, nope, we're going to allow black soldiers. And Congress follows it up with the Militia Act. And the Militia Act specifically says, here is how you will enlist black soldiers. Here's what you're going to do when you enlist former slaves. And furthermore, the Militia Act provides that the wife and children of slaves who are now free and enlisted, that their family members will also be free. So remember I said Lincoln needed the support of Congress to win the war, to go to emancipation. He's getting the support. Congress is moving faster than Lincoln. But what Congress doesn't know, of course, is that Lincoln has already figured out where he's going. In the middle of this, in August, the New York Tribune, edited by an anti-slavery editor named Horace Greeley, publishes an editorial called A Plea from 20 Million. And in the Plea from 20 Million, Horace Greeley urges Lincoln to end slavery. He says the 20 million is the North. He says the plea of the North is to end slavery. Lincoln does something which I think no other president has ever done. He writes a letter to the editor and it gets published. And in his letter to the editor, he writes to Greeley and he says that my only goal as president is to preserve the Union. I would preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves. I would preserve the Union by freeing some of the slaves. I would preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves. My only goal is to preserve the Union. But here's the problem. By this time, August 1862, more than 100,000 slaves have already been freed. The Militia Act has said we're going to free slaves and put them into the army. The Second Confiscation Act has said the process of how you free slaves. So when Lincoln says, I would preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, that boat has sailed. That's no longer going to happen. Slaves are already being freed, and slaves are now running to the U.S. Army. Every time the U.S. Army moves further into the South, slaves run away from plantations and come to the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army is becoming a army of liberation. It is becoming an army that will end slavery. And so when Lincoln says, my only goal is to preserve the Union, and I would do it by the following, he's being political. What he's really doing is telling Northern conservatives. What he's really doing is telling Southerners, get ready, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen because I have to make it happen. And to Northern conservatives, whites in the North who are afraid of emancipation, afraid of black people, are racist, who don't want to offend the South, he's telling those white people, I'm going to have to do this to save the Union. Get ready for it. It's going to come about. So he's preparing the nation for what he is doing. And then he ends his letter by saying something very important. He says, this statement is a description of my, quote, official duty. And he italicizes official, he underlines it. This is my official duty and does not change my oft expressed personal wish, and you get italicized personal, that all men everywhere could be free. And of course, throughout his life, Lincoln has said that. He says in one letter, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. He also says, another point, that he is naturally anti-slavery. Now, this is a very interesting thing, because today, of course, we think of slavery as this gigantic abomination. How could there possibly be slavery in the world? But of course, we know that slavery has always existed. Slavery has existed in every culture at every time. And, we still deal with the effects of the enslavement of millions of people by the Germans in World War II. And not only Jews who were brought to concentration camps and worked as slaves, but many, many Europeans who weren't Jewish were enslaved. In fact, the head of the labor ministry in Nazi Germany is executed at Nuremberg for enslaving people. And these are people of all ethnic groups in Europe. Everywhere Hitler went, he brought people back to Germany as slaves. So slavery is hardly a remote historical event. Slavery exists all over the world at various times. But particularly in the United States, when Lincoln is growing up, when Lincoln becomes an adult, slavery is an accepted, constitutionally protected, legally created institution. And therefore, to be anti-slavery, you have to learn to oppose slavery. You have to be taught that slavery is wrong because it's not intuitive. George Washington owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned his own kids. He had children with his slave Sally Hemings. They were not only his children, they were his slaves. So when Lincoln says, I am naturally anti-slavery, what he's saying is, I didn't have to read a book on this. I didn't have to go to an abolitionist lecture. I didn't have to be taught that slavery is wrong. I knew slavery was wrong from day one. And in fact, everything we know about Lincoln is that the very first time he encounters slavery, when he's about 19 years old and he takes a flatboat down the Mississippi to sell things in New Orleans, he is shocked by slavery and he hates it. And so Lincoln says, I am naturally anti-slavery, and my oft expressed wish is that all men everywhere could be free. So this is late August. In early September, another group of ministers comes to Lincoln. Ministers are always coming to Lincoln, asking him to do something about slavery. And of course, by this time, Lincoln is doing a lot about slavery because he is enlisting black troops. General Rufus Saxton in South Carolina, who is the commander at Hilton Head, he is training black soldiers. So by August 1862, at precisely the time that Lincoln is telling the Horace Greeley, I would preserve the Union in any way I could, he's also got 3 regiments of black soldiers being trained in South Carolina. This is clearly going to end slavery. So black soldiers are being enlisted. They have guns. They have bayonets. By the way, there is nothing scarier to a white Southerner, nothing scarier in the world than a Negro with a gun and a bayonet. This is the scariest. This is their greatest nightmare, that these people are going to take revenge on them for slavery. But of course, what these young men want is simply freedom for themselves and their families. By the end of the Civil War, 10% of the U.S. Army will be made up of blacks, most of whom are former slaves. It will be a very important aspect of the ending of the war. So all of this is going on. Black soldiers are being enlisted. The Militia Act is in place. The Emancipation Proclamation is written, but only the cabinet knows about it. And in September, another group of ministers, this time from Chicago, come to Lincoln and they say, will you please free the slaves? And he says, I'd like to free the slaves, but first I have to secure Kentucky. Now this again is a kind of a political statement because he already has Kentucky. Kentucky's been secured since Grant took those forts in Tennessee. But he says to the ministers, he says, if I emancipate the slaves without securing Kentucky, I will take 50,000 bayonets, that is 50,000 soldiers, out of the U.S. Army, and they will move to the Confederate Army. So he's being coy. He is sort of playing the political role. He furthermore says that I can't free the slaves unless I know I'm going to win the war. He makes a very interesting analogy. He says, if I free the slaves without knowing I'm going to win the war, it will be like the Pope's bull against the comet. Now, I have to explain this to you. A papal bull is a statement by the Pope saying something is true or something must happen. Papal bulls are issued by popes on issues of theology, on issues of church governance. And there is a belief, it turns out it's not true, it's a myth. It's a myth mostly promulgated by Protestants who didn't like the Pope, that a medieval Pope issued a papal bull against Halley's Comet coming to the world. You can imagine how effective that was, right? And so, but Lincoln is turning to these Protestant ministers from Chicago and he says, if I can't win the war, then emancipating the slaves will be like the Pope's bull against the comet. It will be useless. It will have no effect. It won't mean anything. So I can only issue the Emancipation Proclamation. I can only free slaves when I know I'm going to win the war. This is September 13th. 9 days later, on September 22nd, Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And he issues the proclamation because in the intervening period, the United States has won a great victory at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. And after the victory at Antietam, Lincoln now thinks, I'm going to win the war. I now have this great victory. I'm now moving towards victory. And now is the time. And he times it the 22nd, so it will be exactly 100 days until January 1st. And he says, in 100 days, I will free the slaves. I have no doubt, by the way, if the Battle of Antietam had been a month later, he would have said, in 75 days, I'm going to free the slaves. Because he wants January 1st. And in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, he says, I issue this in my capacity as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in the United States. So here's the interesting thing. All along, he's been saying, I can't free the slaves until I know I'm going to win the war. Now he says, I must free the slaves in order to win the war. So which is true? And the answer, I think, is the first one. I think by September, he thinks he will win the war. He doesn't need emancipation to win the war, but it's surely going to help. But constitutionally, he can't say, I'm ending slavery because I don't like slavery. But he can say constitutionally, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I will end slavery because we need to end slavery to win this war. And so that's the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He also does something which, again, is politically very clever. He says, I will free the slaves if the Confederates do not come back to the Union within 100 days. In other words, he's giving the Confederates one more chance to return. Now, why is he doing this? Not because he doesn't want to free the slaves. He's not backtracking. And there are, by the way, some historians who say, he's only freeing the slaves to win the war, and if he could win the war without freeing the slaves, he won't, and he's, backtracking. Nonsense. He knows perfectly well the Confederates are not going to come back into the Union. He's speaking this time to northern whites who are uncomfortable with emancipation, just as in his first inaugural, he was speaking to southern whites, urging them to come back to the Union. He's saying to the northern conservatives, the northern Democrats, the northern racists, look, you guys, I'm giving these people one more chance, one more 100 days, and then it's going to be over. Then I'm going to free their slaves. And so 100 days later, Lincoln issues the final Emancipation Proclamation as Commander-in-Chief of the Army to free the slaves. Meanwhile, the proclamation is published here. This is, by the way, a wonderful poster of the proclamation, because it shows proclamation of freedom to millions, and it has the Emancipation Proclamation. And then underneath, there's an advertisement for a show, Haverly's Genuine Colored Minstrels. So you can kind of see the juxtaposition of freedom and racism still going on in the United States. The other thing that's happening, of course, is now you have the full-fledged enlistment. It's not just 3 regiments in South Carolina. And by the way, there were 2 regiments in Louisiana that were also being trained. It's now everywhere. And so you have this poster, men of color to arms, now or never, 3 years service, no longer 100 days, 3 years service. And it's signed by a number of leading black activists, including Frederick Douglass. And here we have another poster, come and join us, brothers. And you see a group of U.S. Army soldiers, all of whom are black, with their white officer. They don't yet have black officers. There will be a few black officers, but most of the officers will be white. And you even have a little black drummer boy there. And it says, come and join us, brothers. Come and join us in ending slavery. And so Lincoln moves to end slavery. And that is what happens. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1861, ending slavery. Now, at the very beginning of the talk, I mentioned the argument that the Emancipation Proclamation is like a bill of lading. This had been in a book chapter written by Professor Richard Hofstadter, who was one of the great historians of the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. And Hofstadter said that the Emancipation Proclamation had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. Hofstadter was a, sort of snarky professor chipping away at Lincoln. I think if you could conjure up Lincoln and say, some Columbia University historian said, in the 1940s that the Emancipation Proclamation had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading, Lincoln probably would have said, yeah, that's right. I'm a railroad lawyer. How do railroads operate? People put freight on a railroad train in New York with a bill of lading, and it ends up in Illinois. I like bills of ladings. There is one journalist who understands this completely. After the Emancipation Proclamation is written, the Civil War correspondent for the London Times writes that the president issues, quote, his most formidable decrees, which he hurls at the enemy and which will never lose their historic significance, resemble, as the author intends them to resemble, an ordinary summons sent by one lawyer to another. By the way, that correspondent was a fellow named Karl Marx. You might have heard of him because, of course, he does many things in life. So, in the end, when the preconditions are created, when it is possible to end slavery militarily, when he has a constitutional theory, when he has Congress behind him, when he knows the people of the North are going to be behind him because Congress is saying that the Northerners will support it. In the end, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. It is a bill of lading. A bill of lading is designed to deliver goods from one place to the other. And what Lincoln is doing is delivering 3 million Southern slaves from slavery to freedom. And of course, the emancipation does not come immediately because the Emancipation Proclamation is the proclamation of a president Obviously, in the middle of Georgia, in the middle of Alabama, Southerners don't say, oh, well, Lincoln freed the slaves, I gotta let the slave go. The Georgians, the Alabamans say, we got to enlist and continue to fight. But when Sherman's army begins to march from Vicksburg all the way to South Carolina, across Georgia, Sherman's army is 50 miles wide, the army. It is a huge army. And everywhere that army goes, slaves are free. So sometime late at night, when you turn on the television, you can't find anything but Gone with the Wind. And you're stuck watching Gone with the Wind late at night. And you see the pro-Southern, racist, pro-Confederate view of Gone with the Wind. And you see the destruction of the South. Keep in mind that the army that is marching from Vicksburg to Charleston is the greatest army of human liberation that the world will ever see until the Allies march on Berlin in 1944 and 1945. And that Sherman's army will free more people from slavery and bondage, more people from oppression, than any other armies until the armies of the Allies crushed Nazism in 1945. And when you see that, and when you understand what the war is all about, then you realize that Lincoln succeeds in his wish, his personal wish, that all men everywhere could be free. Thank you very much.
Wow, so thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Dr. Finkelman for his really engaging presentation and walking us through Lincoln's political strategies in his mind and what he was thinking and how he did put an end to slavery. You can join us next month on Wednesday, March 13th, when Dr. Monica Rice, who's the director of Gratz College's Holocaust and Genocide Studies programs, she will discuss Poland under the Law and Justice Party. And her webinar is the first of our 6-month subscription series. And to sign up for this series, please refer to the email that you received in order to access this webinar. Thank you very much and have a good day.